An American politician flies to Israel, but then takes a detour to the occupied West Bank. What happened next said a lot about reality there. The story Palestinians are desperate to tell, the one Israel is determined to conceal. The Sudanese city of el-Obeid is on the verge of being closed off from the world. We speak with the only international journalist currently reporting from there. Plus, South Korea and the political influencer the military police had their eyes on, but who is still making news. For American politicians, particularly those with ambitions for higher office, Israel is often the first stop on their overseas travel agenda. Their itineraries are largely arranged by their Israeli counterparts and have a performative aspect to them, photo ops included. But last week, a U.S. Congressman Ro Khanna broke with that pattern by joining a Palestinian-led delegation through the occupied West Bank. What followed, a confrontation with Israeli settlers and soldiers, told a story that the Netanyahu government doesn't want out there. But Khanna had other ideas. He went everywhere from Fox News to various alternative sites and podcasts to amplify what life is really like for Palestinians under Israeli occupation. The bigger, more troubling question is, why did it take an American and not a Palestinian to get the kind of headlines that the story of the West Bank and the ongoing annexation of it by Israel so clearly deserve? If you are an American congressman, a Democrat like Ro Khanna, and you may have your eye on the presidency in 2028, how do you set yourself apart from the field? The political playbook requires you to make that obligatory trip to Israel. Celebrate the democracy it constantly touts. Visit the Wailing Wall. Tick all the pro-Zionist boxes. Khanna took that mold and broke it. Instead, he went on a tour led by Palestinians and Israeli activists of the occupied West Bank, where they were stopped by armed Israeli settlers out to intimidate. When Israeli soldiers showed up, Khanna says they told his translators they were on the side of the settlers. Khanna and his crew were held against their will for more than an hour. It took a call to the U.S. Embassy to get them out.
The Israeli military, as is its wont, denied these allegations and said that it had heard about a disruption in the area and had resolved the situation. But body camera footage very clearly shows the soldiers cooperating with the settlers and continuing the detainment of the congressman. And the fact that he's able to now talk from personal experience about what he saw in the West Bank is a step in the right direction.
A congressperson going deep into the occupied West Bank, going to visit villages that have been depopulated by violent settlers, it is significant. And that just goes to show how normal it was for American politicians to visit the region and go to Israel and speak to Israeli politicians and Israeli representatives.
This happens to Palestinians all the time, and why are they not believed? And why is it that they're only believed when this happens to a U.S. congressman? There has been change recently in the U.S. with regards to what's happening in Palestine. But in Congress, the shift has been way slower. Democrats stick to this mantra that they are supporting Israel no matter what.
It is a mantra that is still all over the American airwaves, including on the country's most watched news channel, Fox, where Ro Khanna was asked why he chose to experience the occupation through the Palestinian side.
Sir, why did you not coordinate with Israel on this, knowing they're staunch allies of the United States, knowing the recent history of the October 7th massacre?
CBS News spoke to Israel's ambassador in Washington, who questioned Khanna's itinerary, his agenda.
We suggested he visit with survivors of the October 7th massacre, that he visit the borders so he understands the issues that we have on our borders, and so on. He ignored that, and he decided to coordinate his trip not with Israel, but with Palestinian activists.
The Israeli prime minister clearly did not like where the story was going. He went on NBC's Meet the Press, on the same program Khanna appeared on. Benjamin Netanyahu deployed his usual defense of the settlers. It's just a few bad apples.
There is a vigilante effort, not by the settler community. They're 99.9% law-abiding citizens.
Leaving out the part about how they are backed by Israeli soldiers, the state. Khanna, meanwhile, quoted several Israeli media outlets, like Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post, that backed his version of the story, telling it in a way that Fox did not.
In the case of the Fox News interview, it goes even further when Ro Khanna responds by pointing out that these are actually untruths. Then the interviewer feels a sense of outrage. How dare you question Israeli officials? How could they all be lying?
Sir, you have now said the ambassador is lying, the IDF is lying, the U.S. Embassy is lying. At a certain point...
As opposed to accusing a U.S. member of Congress of lying, that somehow is more plausible. And then immediately moves into, well, why didn't you coordinate with the Israeli government? I mean, it's the entire thing is absurd.
Whereas, Israelis, their word is treated as gospel. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, who's not exactly very popular, can go on a U.S. network channel and say that it's only a few bad apples. Anybody who has ever been to the occupied West Bank knows that settlers are way more than a few bad apples. They're one of the scariest things that can happen to a person in the West Bank. They have no moral compass.
What we've seen over the last several months is the reality of settler violence. And even publications like the Jerusalem Post, a right-wing outlet, being able to acknowledge that there are cases of settler violence. On the other hand, it's a story in Israel only because it made headlines in America. If the Americans had been uninterested in it on Meet the Press and Netanyahu hadn't had to respond to it, there would be zero Israeli interest in this story.
Referring to the Israeli authorities, Ro Khanna told the New York Times that detaining a possible candidate for the White House, even a long shot like himself, was not a good idea. But he did go after one of his potential rivals this week, when California Governor Gavin Newsom refused to call Israel an apartheid state.
It is clear apartheid. I used to toss that word around academically. I felt it. I saw it.
Khanna said that while doing a tour of alternative media outlets, where the interviewers are much less wary of criticizing Israel than mainstream journalists are. He made a stop at Hassan Piker's live stream.
An unaccountable force that is backed by U.S. taxpayers and backed by U.S. tax dollars gets to do this to an American congressperson.
He also spoke to Dropsite, whose detailed reporting on Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank takes a backseat to no one. That is where Khanna was caught out. He cannot bring himself to oppose the U.S. selling defensive weaponry to Israel.
The position you're advocating basically amounts to, we need to make sure that the sniper is protected so that he can continue sniping.
An arms embargo completely, which I have not supported, would say Israel can't even get or produce from anyone defensive, the Iron Dome. And I guess my view is, anyone should be able to protect civilian life.
Alternative outlets like Dropsite are popular with the millions of young American voters who, according to the polls, have turned their back on Israel.
They really pressed him on his continued support for Israel being able to secure different defensive weapons capabilities like the Iron Dome. And it clearly seemed to trip him up a little bit.
And so I don't understand why you have even one qualified shred of support for a mass murderer masquerading as the only democracy in the Middle East.
Well, but I'm not saying that the United States should be supporting the funding for Iron Dome, just so we're clear. I'm saying that we shouldn't be restricting Israel from being able to get the Iron Dome or be able to develop the Iron Dome technology-wise.
It was journalists more or less in the same camp as Khanna, but they still press him on the policies where they felt he wasn't going far enough in his criticism of Israel.
And that conversation in particular on Dropsite is not a conversation that could ever be had on a mainstream American media outlet. It is simply a topic that cannot be touched. The default is to always say that Israel has the right to defend itself. The end. And then the question of do Palestinians have the right to defend themselves is simply something that just has never been contemplated by any American official or any mainstream media outlet.
Voices in both Israel and the U.S. have called Ro Khanna's detention a stunt, a politician trying to draw attention to himself. He denies that and has urged news outlets to focus on the victims of the occupation, not just those paying them a visit.
I appreciate that this has been about Americans and me, but the real story I want to come out is the daily life of Palestinians.
But anyone tracking Israel's creeping, illegal annexation of the West Bank, the relatively few stories that get covered, and all the ones that do not, knows that that is wishful thinking.
The only thing that is exceptional about what happened to Ro Khanna is that he's a member of the US Congress. Settler attacks happen many times a day across the entirety of the West Bank that are far more devastating than what Khanna experienced. US citizens and US Congress people get far more media attention than Palestinians facing immense amounts of violence. And that's a deep injustice in how the world works. But it's the reality of that has been on display in the media coverage of this incident.
Because these settlers are never held accountable, despite what Netanyahu has said about going after these vigilantes with the law. That's just a lie. And because this is a US congressperson, it hits every cable network. But when Palestinians experience it, when Palestinians are killed in the West Bank by settler violence, by Israeli soldiers, it doesn't even make the headlines.
Journalists often describe the conflict in Sudan as the forgotten war. Despite being the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, it seldom receives the international coverage it warrants. When it does make headlines, it's usually because events have become impossible to ignore. And the city of el-Obeid may be approaching such a moment. Here with more on that, Nick Muirhead.
The battle to control another major Sudanese city is in the news.
Another humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding in Sudan's besieged city of el-Obeid,
which is surrounded by men from the Rapid Support Forces.
Civilians facing worsening shortages of food, water and medicine.
But there are almost no international journalists covering the story on the ground. El-Obeid has a population of around 500,000 and is the capital of Sudan's North Kordofan state. The Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, control the city, but the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, a paramilitary group opposed to the army, are closing in, striking both military positions and civilian infrastructure, a move we have seen before. In Al-Fasher in western Sudan, the RSF imposed a siege that lasted 18 months before capturing the city in October last year. A UN investigation later found that mass killings, gang rapes, and deliberate starvation took place, acts it said amounted to genocide. For most of the siege, international journalists were shut out, and because communications were also cut, much of what we know came from satellite imagery, bloody streets visible from space. Al Jazeera's Hiba Morgan and her team are among the few international news crews to have reported from inside el-Obeid during the war.
Now, since arriving here, we've seen several fuel stations that have been destroyed by drone strikes, as well as water supplies that have been hit in recent weeks.
We spoke with Morgan just before she left the city. This is what she had to say about the assignment.
The biggest challenge in getting to el-Obeid has been the roads between Kosti in White Nile State to el-Obeid, because it has seen a lot of drone strikes by the RSF, and that includes commercial trucks, fuel tankers, some of them civilian vehicles, and aid convoys. We had to stop several times, check the skies, and see any drones flying overhead before continuing our drive into the city. There's a lot of comparison being made about the situation here in el-Obeid and the city of al-Fasher. Now, the reason why I think it's not a fair comparison is because there is still an open route that connects the city to other parts of army-controlled territory. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. The only way they can ensure that it doesn't happen is if the RSF does not continue the drone strikes that has been targeting vital infrastructure, making life for the people here hard.
In Sudan, media access has become weaponized. The harder it is to report the war, the easier it is to commit war crimes.
About a year and a half ago, in December of 2024, politics in South Korea was in a state of upheaval when the then president declared martial law. There is a new president now who was an opposition leader at the time, Lee Jae-myung. Another figure who has surged in prominence is Kim Ou-joon, an outspoken, controversial voice who leans to the left ideologically and made his name through the media. not the mainstream side. Kim left that space years ago. He now heads the country's biggest YouTube news network, primarily through his political podcast. Kim is part journalist, part activist, part political performer. On the night that martial law was declared, he was the sole media figure the South Korean military tried to arrest. And since then, he has only grown in influence. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on Kim Ou-joon and what he and others like him reveal about the world of politics and media in South Korea.
Let's begin with that standoff in South Korea, which began with the late night.
모든 언론과 출판은 계엄사의 통제를 받는다.
All media in South Korea are coming under the control of martial law. They said are banned under threat of arrest, and the media was censored according to martial law.
인터넷에서 뉴스를 검색하고 있었던 것 같아요.
I was on the internet checking the news. Then someone called and said, "You have to turn on the TV right now." It must have been about a minute after martial law was declared.
비상 계엄을 선포합니다.
Shortly after that, I started getting calls from all over. I was told, "They're coming to get you, so run."
널 잡으러 가니 빨리 도망가라는 얘기였어요.
The night of 3rd December 2024 was pure chaos in South Korea. Martial law had been imposed swiftly and suddenly. And outside the offices of Kim Ou-joon, armed troops gathered with orders to imprison him. In a list of targets that included leading politicians and high-ranking bureaucrats, Kim was the only media person marked for arrest.
Kim Ou-joon was singled out during the martial law because of his political influence and because he had a lot of progressive followers. So it was as if taking the leader of the progressives to take down resistance. The fact that Kim Ou-joon was considered a threat to Yoon Suk-yeol, the conservative administration, I think that really shows how media persona is becoming more of a political force in Korea.
There are definitely a lot of players who have risen in significance, who have benefited directly from the political polarization that has spiked in South Korea over the past decade or so. And as a result, many YouTubers have come up and their views have also surged. Kim Ou-joon's influence and high profile essentially also made him a target of the Yoon administration during martial law as they attempted to arrest him. Also, in the aftermath of martial law, he certainly became a pivotal figure in bringing out more information about what happened in those few hours.
비상계엄 해제 결의하고 해제가 다 되고 난 이후에도 공간 앞에 있었다는.
Kim Ou-joon is a media maverick. His career of nearly 3 decades has spanned radio, television, publishing, and the online space. He has moved from medium to medium, platform to platform, with the determined agility of a man intent on staying relevant and being heard. During South Korea's decade of back-to-back conservative governments that started in 2008, Kim's political criticism was sharp, satirical, and unapologetically oppositional.
그래서 저는 이 외교 안보 라인이 정말 등신에 가깝다. 등신 라인이다.
Kim rose to prominence as the host of a rush-hour radio program in Seoul called News Factory. It aired on the Traffic Broadcasting System, TBS, and was the city's top-rated show for almost all of its 6-year run until 2022. Kim's influence, incessant swearing, at times libelous rants, and liberal bias eventually had repercussions. When the Conservatives returned to power under the presidency of Yoon Suk-yeol, the man who would eventually try to impose martial law, TBS, which relied heavily on public funding, saw its budget slashed, and Kim and his program, News Factory, were forced off the air. As it turned out, this was a gear shift moment for Kim. He launched his YouTube channel in January 2023, and his audience not only followed him, it multiplied. Kim's YouTube channel is called Gyomsonen Himderda. Gyomson means modesty or humility, and the name translates roughly to humility is hard, and it fits Kim's persona perfectly. He is irreverent and unfiltered. His online network now sits in the top ranks of South Korea's media. In his view, it's a necessary corrective in a landscape dominated by conservative players.
아주 오랜 시간 동안
For a very long time, our media environment has been monopolized by the conservatives. And now they talk about polarization. What polarization? For there to be polarization, there must be 2 poles. But all this time, there was only one side, one pole dominating the media. So when people say there is a polarization, that actually means balance has been restored, because the other side has finally appeared, and both poles are fighting it out at last.
이제야.
Kim Ou-joon has been one of the most listened to pundits in South Korean politics for quite a few years now, and his style is one that really pushes boundaries and essentially makes big claims, catering more to progressive audiences. And in doing so, quite often he is willing to really take things to extremes, often focusing more on delivering opinions, not always backing it up with factual evidence, and even occasionally verging on conspiracy theories.
그 카르텔에 균열을 내겠다. 편파적으로. 그러나 그 편파에 이르는 과정은 공정할 것이다.
Kim Ou-joon's relationship with conspiracies is something he's given a lot of thought to.
그 입증되기 전까지
Until it is proven, every hypothesis is a conspiracy. But when you are dealing with power, you can't wait until everything is proven before you raise issues, because they can conceal or distort facts to their advantage. I'm not at all embarrassed to be called a conspiracy theorist.
부끄럽지 않다는 거죠.
Unverified claims, rumors, and anonymous tip-offs are central to Kim's political output, and his record is mixed. One of the most outrageous conspiracies he pushed was an alleged assassination plot against a conservative politician. It proved to be false. But another claim that a Supreme Court judge was possibly biased against the current president is now at the center of an ongoing audit of that judge's conduct. Amidst the political turmoil in South Korea, Kim has seemingly become a kingmaker for the Liberal Democratic Party. In the space of a year, more than 100 Democratic members of parliament appeared on his YouTube channel. Kim's political clout has earned him nicknames like Political Shaman Kim Ou-joon or the President of Chung-jong-ro, which is where his studio is located.
So Kim Ou-joon emerged as a progressive spokesperson with the image of rebel who fights against the conservative media. I do think he played a role, an influential role, in diversifying the forms of media outside the legacy media with like his online newspapers or podcasts, and now YouTube, which kind of shows that politics can exist outside of the traditional media and can be interactive.
저런 얘기를 하잖아요.
You hear people say things like the media should be free from partisanship. They talk about journalism's duty of fairness or its so-called ethical standards. To me, that's a 20th century concept of journalistic ethics. For example, take a story like Gaza. The cost of being non-partisan, of being neutral, is the normalization of Palestinian people being killed, isn't it?
오늘 8시 뉴스는 팔레스타인 무장 세력 하마스와 이스라엘 간 무력 충돌 소식으로 시작하겠습니다. 하루 만에 양쪽에서 4,000명이 넘는 사상자가 나왔습니다.
Neutrality is not the same as fairness.
중립이 곧 공정이 아니에요.
South Korea's media landscape is peppered with the likes of Kim Ou-joon. He is one of the most influential voices, but he does have competition. In the progressive YouTube space, there are Mabel Show and Voice of Seoul. Amongst right-wing influencers are political scientist Ko Sung-kook and history lecturer turned political activist John Han-gil. Together with many others, these voices have created a cacophony that they say is a response to a compromised mainstream media. Observers of the country's politics, however, say the YouTube influencers are part of a, quote, democratic regression from below.
It is quite important for South Korea that credible journalism returns stronger than before. But the question is, where is this robust journalism really going to come from? At the moment, certainly a lot of people have lost their faith in mainstream media who are more focused on maintaining their access to those in power and often indulge in self-censorship. At the same time, there are a lot of newer media outlets, news influencers as well, who essentially seem more focused on catering to their bases, delivering opinions rather than facts, rather than credible journalism. So people like Kim Ou-joon have fundamentally reshaped the media environment in South Korea. But have they resolved the conundrum of political polarization and the lack of factual information? Not really.
And finally, the Trump administration is threatening to revoke the broadcast licenses of American TV networks that chose not to air the president's speech this past Thursday. That speech saw Trump revive his claims that electoral fraud cost him the 2020 election, allegations that have been thoroughly and repeatedly debunked. NBC, ABC, and CNN all chose not to broadcast the speech in full. To no one's surprise, Fox News and CBS both aired large portions of it live. Fox, because that's what Fox does. And CBS, because it was taken over by the Ellison family last year and has been out to please the president ever since.
There is an argument that it's irresponsible to air the president's speech tonight. But this speech will be made, it will be news, and it's our job to cover the news.
Democratic Senator Mark Warner wasn't buying it.
I was embarrassed that the President of the United States went before our whole country and networks like yours carried this as news, as opposed to a rehash of falsehoods.
But this is not just about fake news from the president, rehashed. Analysts say that Trump is laying the groundwork for the midterm elections in November, which the polls say do not look good for the Republicans. So Americans are preparing for more claims of electoral fraud. The battle lines have been drawn, and the networks that broadcast Trump's speech in full have let it be known, once again, where they stand. Thanks for watching. Now leave a comment and let us know what you made of this week's program. If you'd like to follow the show and stay updated, you can find links to our social media channels and our newsletter in the description below.